to start up with last week's scenario. And hopefully everybody was able to get together as a chapter and go through it. It's really important to meet as a chapter for these scenarios. You get to know each other better, and there are many experts with different backgrounds and different ideas. And remember, in these scenarios, there is not one correct answer. There's just a bunch of possibilities, and that's the great part about discussing the scenarios in front of everybody, is that, you know, sometimes we get these like, oh, that's a good idea and possibility for using in the future. Just like any deployment, you learn to work with what you have. So we'll discuss the scenarios, and then Garrick will continue the training on how other functions use the non-congregate shelter tracking tool. And then we'll be going into the sheltered resident transition. So it should be a really good meeting today. Gary, did you want to start off with the scenario?
Cool. Yeah, happy to. Diana, do you want me to facilitate the whole conversation or just work through the reminder on the scenario?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead and just do it all if you want, or no. Let's see.
Cool. Okay. Let me get it pulled up. One moment. And we are go. So cool. Thanks. Yeah. So last week, quick recap, right? 2 weeks ago now, we had JC on doing the non-congregate client tracking tool scenario, kind of work through, and then we had a scenario with a couple of differing questions than usual, a couple of extra ones to help us start to solidify our process here within Colorado, Wyoming. So the scenario was at 4 p.m. There were 102 families evacuated to a center at a local elementary school due to a wildfire. Then we learned that of those 102 families, 26 of them needed an overnight accommodation at a non-congregate shelter, and our strike team had been tasked with having them in a room by 7 p.m. in the evening. We did have our standard set of those 7 questions on problem trying to solve, top priorities, who did we notify and how, workforce, etc. But we added in a few extra ones, and that feels like a good place to start. And so I believe the normal process is we go round robin across all of the strike teams. So we'll start with the one down in Southeast, and then we'll work our way to Mile High, Noka, Wyoming, and then south, the Western. And really just interested to hear your thoughts, how it went, and specifically, right, those 3 questions that we wanted to have answered in addition were, how did you determine who will need overnight lodging accommodations? What was the process for registering clients? And then what were the supplies needed? And I am pulling those up on the screen currently. So those should be visible to everybody now. And so we'll start down in Southeast. Super interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Morning, Garrick. This is Thea. Lori's not able to be with us today, so I'm representing Sika with some other members of my team here. So what we decided for the 26 people that were determined who needed lodging, these are ones that didn't have any other place to stay. Some of them had medical needs that had to be accommodated in a hotel since they were already evacuated. Also the evacuation status of the area. Were they in mandatory evacuation? Were they involuntary? Were they pre-evacuation? That would help determine, you know, who got the priorities. DI possibilities, if they needed our help there, if they needed extra assistance to come in earlier, even if they weren't in mandatory, any fragile people. Also, if there were pets, some hotels do take pets, some don't take pets. And also the kind of the size of the family, if they would fit in 1 or 2 rooms or how many rooms. What process you will use to register the clients. We decided that we were going to, at the evacuation center, when people were there, those 26 people, we were going to fill out the log form for them there, then call the hotels to make sure they still had openings there, and at that time reserve a slot for them there. And then give them a certain period of time to get that to that hotel, like 2 hours. If they're not there, then they would lose that reservation. Then they would take that paper with them to the manager at the hotel, who would already know through communication that they had a reservation there that was confirmed with the desk there. The other way they could have done it is just sent them to the hotel. But then again, the rooms might have been filled. They might not be holding all the rooms. Maybe they were over the amount that Red Cross reserved. Let me see. Also, then when they got to the site, then they would be put into the the job tool spreadsheet, not at the evacuation center. What materials and supplies to be successful? Basically forms, signs that need to be posted where the main entrance is. If it's a hotel, if it's one side of the hotel or a room as opposed to the main waiting area. Snacks and water, the shelter kit, and your COVID supplies. And you could still be successful without a computer and a Red Cross phone for the time being, but that would be helpful as it continues on. So that's Seco's input.
Cool. Thank you, Thea. So just to confirm, you can still see the PowerPoint presentation, correct?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm taking notes, and I wanted to make sure that my notes weren't covering up the screen for everybody. So
there you go.
Sweet. Thank you so much, Thea. I appreciate you walking us through there. Anything else you want to highlight from conversations with the team before we roll on to Mile High?
No, but the team that we had, they definitely got a great lesson in doing the spreadsheet, and a couple of the people that were interesting to place in what hotel. I think the big thing that comes up in real world is certain people want certain hotels. Even though we try to accommodate personal preference, sometimes it just doesn't work. For the instance, people with 6 people, we're able to give them 2 rooms. Of course, you're going to have 2 rooms, but some want 4 in a room, or some of the rooms at some hotels might only accommodate 2 people. So making sure you screen the people, how many rooms and how to place them appropriately, especially when you're becoming short of rooms of who can go where. So it might not be the hotel of preference, but at least they have a warm, safe place to stay.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for that, Thea. I'm glad that you all had good practice with the tool. That was the whole intention of it. So perfect. Cool. Anybody have any thoughts or questions for Thea and the Seco team? And if there's hands up or things in the chat, I cannot see those, just so you guys know.
Barb, Lucas, do you have a question? Your hand is up.
No, that was a mistake.
And I don't see anything in the chat, Garrett.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you so much, Thea. We appreciate it. We'll continue our travels northward. We'll go to the Mile High area. Anybody on from there that wants to talk about how it went, kind of high level overall, anything you learned, and then some of the more specific questions.
Yeah, this is Jessica Austin. I'm the mass care lead for Mile High. And so this, kind of echoing what Thea said, was a very helpful tool. I think the team really enjoyed kind of the thought process behind it and going through just kind of to even jog the memories, because a lot of us were in Cameron Peak. So, you know, a lot of the things with lodging and having, you know, deciding where the client forms were going to be filled out and all of those things kind of came into play this time because we ran into them last time with the non-congregate sheltering. And Thea kind of covered, you know, everything I was going to say. I just kind of on a more detailed level, we had picked out maybe the need for some DMH because there was some medication things, and then there were also there was a client who couldn't locate his family, and there was a client who had lost a pet. So we kind of were discussing what kind of services we would provide to those people kind of as we're moving through this situation. We did note, again, from Cameron Peak that the La Quinta we know takes pets. So we kind of were able to align those families that had pets with that shelter. In regard to the COVID patient or the client who had COVID symptoms, we decided that we would just check with the hotel and see if he could isolate in a room at one of the non-congregates that we had decided on. We did cut out the more expensive resort hotel. Although our thought process was if one of the other hotels wasn't willing to let him isolate with other clients, that we could possibly use one of the rooms overnight at the resort. Otherwise, yeah, materials and supplies, just signage, managers kits, making sure we have enough forms, PPE, everything to kind of set up and run through, from to start to finish. Yeah, so that was a Mile High in a nutshell. Like I said, Thea covered a lot of what I was going to cover. So that was, thanks for that, Thea.
Cool. Thanks, Jessica. I appreciate the attentiveness to the nuances of the individuals, right? The COVID, the loss of a pet, the can't connect with family. So cool to hear that was built in as you guys were working through it. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Any thoughts or questions for Jessica and the Mile High team?
And I don't see anything in the chat, Garrett.
Cool. Thanks, Thea. Sweet. We'll continue our travels northward to the northern NOCO Wyoming team, and excited to hear from you all if anybody's on, because with lots of experience from Cameron Peak, I think this was a cool refresh reminder process.
So this is Karen, and we did meet and agreed this was a scenario, had a lot of items in it that we faced during the Cameron Peak fire and all the evacuations that came along with it. We did wonder if the snakes were poisonous or not, though, and wondered if that would have an impact on if the hotel would take them. And of course, we would give a heads up to the Humane Society about taking the snakes and ferret if the hotels were unwilling to take them. A lot, like you said, a lot of things have been covered already, but we would certainly get with the hotels regarding ADA compliance and making sure that, like, if you have a ADA room, that they're on the first floor, especially if people are in wheelchairs, because someone was saying that some hotels, if they're just like a 2-story hotel, they may not have elevators, and so the room couldn't be above, it would have to be below. How many are available, which is another thing, and then special needs in feeding. We were concerned about how we're going to feed them and what kind of special needs might be there that we would have to address. The final item was just making sure that we have consistent communication with the EOC and government ops to make sure the correct information is going out to our partners and out to the public so they know what's going on. That's about it.
Great. Thanks for sharing, Karen. Yeah, we tried to make it as realistic as possible, and while it was definitely a snapshot, the feeding piece that comes into play, and I don't think the snakes were poisonous, but the next scenario we'll be sure that we detail out if they're poisonous or not. Sweet, cool. Any thoughts or questions for Karen and the team? Cool.
And
Hearing
nothing in the
none.
chat.
Great, thanks. The
Oh, we did have
hearing
one
none,
that
we'll
just popped.
go.
We have
Hey,
one that
Garrett.
just popped up in the chat, Garrett. It was from Michelle Floss. We also housed some people that were not in evacuation zone, but lived along main axis and they did not want a traffic interference in EMS. So she's saying basically, like we were doing, we were allowing people that needed an extra time to get there to be allowed to check in, even though they weren't in a mandatory evacuation.
Perfect. Thanks for highlighting that. And then I heard a voice as well. I didn't quite catch who it was.
It was me. It was Ed. I'm typing it in now. I was just going to say poisonous snakes have slit eyes. Non-poisonous have round eyes, other than a coral snake. So that's a quick identification of your snakes, whether or not to really avoid them.
I hope I'm never close enough to a snake where I can see if its eyes are rounded or slit.
I'm so glad you said that. I was gonna be like, "Oh, are all snakes are scary?" That's fine.
And Ed, at a later date, I'd be very interested to know why you know that. But
I've been
Okay,
We
up close
appreciate the
and
lesson for the
personal
day.
on many.
Yeah, this is Michelle. In my defense, in my family, if you lost a snake, it wasn't because it passed, it was because it got out and you needed to find it before everybody else did in the house. So that's where I was coming from on the snake question. My sister used to keep them.
cool. Yeah, awesome. Appreciate the light humor mixed in. So we'll head to WECO, which I believe is now known as the Best Slope as opposed to the West Slope. So if anybody is on from out there, would love to hear how it went, kind of the thoughts, anything additional you'd like to add that maybe hasn't been said so far.
I'm on, Garrett, but I haven't done anything. I wasn't involved last week and haven't even seen this actually.
Gary, I've got an email from Della who did it, and she was unable to join us this morning, but she did send it, so I will just go ahead and read out what she put. I'm looking for it here. All right, for
Thanks, Jane.
scenario number 2, hotel availability, I would choose La Quinta Inn since they have 13 rooms and we will need 11 rooms since one of the families have 7 people, two being children and 5 adults, and the other has 6 adults. So each of these families will need 2 rooms. I would like to keep it to 1 hotel so we have less of a need for volunteers until it becomes necessary to open another hotel because fire grew. More people were out of their home. I would also need to see if the hotel I am sending them to takes pets like dogs and cats. If hotel does not, we need to see who will take them in along with all of the exotic pets like the snakes and the ferret. La Quinta Inn, this is hotel information. La Quinta Inn costs $80 per room, which is only $11 more than Travel Lodge by Wyndham. However, they only had 10 rooms. So our best bet was to pay a little more and get everyone in one location. That is it.
Great. Thanks, Diana. Appreciate you sharing that on behalf. And
Garrick,
Della,
I
tell her
just have
thank
a
you for
quick
sending that
comment.
in. Yeah.
You know what I found out especially in Fort Collins, even though CLC wasn't involved in the beginning, when CLC actually reserves rooms, those rooms are paid for whether you use them or not. When CLC does it. So I know people are trying to save money and stuff, but I think if you need more rooms, it's always better to go with a cheaper one. But we found that if those rooms are left vacant, Red Cross is paying for them anyway. So you have a little more breathing room to give them either a larger room, maybe one that has a kitchen if they have people that require special diets or something like that. just kind of my thoughts and working with CLC, knowing how they work it, and they will definitely charge. You don't get it free if the room's not occupied.
Yeah, thanks for calling that up, Thea. And I'll make the connection there, right? That's why understanding who's in our hotel, what rooms they're in are so important, because it helps us balance the presented need versus any potential need to grow. So maybe we hold a few extra rooms, but we don't want to be carrying 30 extra rooms because we're paying for those, right? It's not like a kind reservation thing where we'll just hold these for you. It's like, no, they're under contract and we're paying for them.
Right. And I do have the CLC guru in the chat agreed that you need to use the CLC rooms first. What happened, just a lesson learned, I guess, what happened in Cameron Peak at the beginning, of course, when I first got there, we were actually gearing down. We were gearing down. We were down to almost one hotel the night that it all blew up, and they had over 300 rooms reserved. So quickly we had to determine, I know working with Karen, that we were going to release those rooms from CLC because we were paying for 300 rooms and we only needed like 26 at the time. So we released all those, so Red Cross wasn't obligated to pay for them. But then of course we needed them again and we were able to get them back, but we were able to get them back on space available until it got bigger and bigger. And then CLC had to come back into the scene and do it. So it was kind of crazy.
Yeah, just echoing the importance that we do need to be financially responsible with our resources and our hotels that have come up, right? So cool, thanks for that, Thea. So one other thing I want to talk about before we continue on in our agenda for the day is how very specifically, like, how did using the non-congregate client tracking tool go? The spreadsheet, was it simple? Was it clunky? I'd just be interested to hear some specific thoughts about that. And if, just kind of the overall thoughts of using that. Was this a helpful endeavor to get more familiar with it? Feedback if we do something like this again, etc. So if we could, we'll open it up to everybody. If we can do this in a semi-controlled fashion, like raise your hand or put a comment in the chat box, that just keeps us from talking over one another. Go for it, Jessica.
Yeah. So I was going to say, and I meant to say that when I was chatting earlier, we did have a talk about the tracker tool, and we all agreed that it is very useful. The problem we ran into was the availability of the tech, and then also kind of, I guess, a baseline training. You know, obviously we rolled this out in the middle of Cameron Peak, so we didn't really have any training available, but we kind of talked about maybe having a baseline training on, you know, this is where you go to access this in Teams, because a lot of people really didn't even know what was going on. And so there was a learning curve kind of in the middle of this chaos. So, you know, that would maybe be our feedback moving forward, is kind of making sure one, that the tech is available, so they have, you know, they have their computers to put it into the system, so they're not, you know, writing it down, losing written pieces of paper, things like that. And then also making sure that just going into it, they have a baseline training, you know, where to locate it, not to copy and paste. You know, there were different things that we were kind of told to do and not to do within the tool. So just those kinds of things would be helpful moving forward.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jessica. Wholeheartedly agreed. And as we think about responses here, hopefully, if we can, Cameron Peak experiences are super valuable, and then interested to hear about how over the past 2 weeks or so, if anybody used the tool during the exercise and scenario to put in names and et cetera and kind of click around. Was that a helpful thing, as Jessica reinforced the need for that baseline training and starting to get more familiar with it? So, yeah, Michelle, I see your hands up as well.
Yes, I think there were two things that really came up during Cameron Peak, and I believe they've already taken a look at them to move forward with. But we had some issues with data that was taken from the clients coming in. They had like primary and secondary phones listed versus cell phone and landline. And we spent a lot of time trying to reach people at their landline because it wasn't specified which was which. And then the other thing is when we were doing some of our documentation in the tracking tool, we noticed that some people would go in during the read-only version and others would go in, I guess, in the other version, and they would condense the tracking form so they could see just the portion that they were working in. But that locked us out of expanding the tool back out so we could access our section of the tracking tool.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that, Michelle. We appreciate it. Yeah. Any other thoughts out there before we continue along? And I'm going to blab for just a little bit to give people time to think. Where we're going to go next after this is we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some different functions and how they would use the non-congregate client tracking tool. Sue is on and she's going to talk a little bit about unification. We will try and find IDC and see if they're available to join. And then we'll end our time today really diving and sinking our teeth into shelter resident transition. And all of you get to be the test subjects for a course we're hosting tomorrow that we get to present more on. So with that, any other final thoughts about scenario, the exercise using the non-congregate client tracking tool, etc.?
Garrick, there's a couple in the chat I can read to you. Bob Springer says Al Ladoff recorded an initial training during the Cameron Peak Larimer episode, which was really helpful. So he did that on site as it was going on. And Tom Belke said the tracker is the main information tool used through beginning to SRT to LTR. I used it as a reference and as an indicator of client involvement.
Great, thanks, Thea. And just so we're not speaking in acronyms, SRT is shelter resident transition, LTR is long-term recovery. Tom, thank you for continuing to serve down in Louisiana. 7 to 8 months after the storm hit. We appreciate it. Awesome, cool. So we'll, Diana, before we continue on, anything else on scenario that you want to touch on or make sure we cover?
No, that was very, very good feedback. Thank you.
I have a question. This is Barb.
Hi,
Can
Bob.
you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
One of the things that came up when you were looking at the list of people, I can't remember. If you can put that list back up, I'd appreciate it. It was one of them lives in Grand Junction. We were trying to figure out why we were putting him up anyway.
I'm working on getting it back up for you, Barb. I think that is a perfect catch, so it might take a little bit to come up. I appreciate
Bruno
you.
Mars.
I forgot that was
So
added.
yeah, Barb.
Bruno Mars lives in Grand Junction, so we. Hello.
Yeah, can you hear? I was going to say something about him, but then somebody had mentioned, and they made a good point about maybe not being mandatory evacuation zones, but being kind of an inhibitor to law enforcement and emergency personnel. So we were allowing people who were not in mandatory zones, if they were going to be in the way of law enforcement or fire, to lodge for a night if they needed extra time.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for adding that in. Barb, do you have any thoughts on how you guys approach this, what you would do, etc.?
No, I remember we were talking about it because it just caught one of our people, I can't remember who it was, caught it and said, well, Grand Junction, why? And I guess I didn't catch it in this meeting, but it just, when you look at it just at first, you don't catch it. And when we caught it, it struck us really funny. So I just wanted to bring it up. And we'd have to check. We'd have to find out why, whatever the reason is, like Jessica said. I guess that was Jessica. So no, I'm good now.
Cool. Yeah, both Barb and Jessica, thank you very much for bringing attention to this and calling that out. Intentionally that was thrown in there to make us stop and pause and say, oh, how come there's someone from Grand Junction when everybody else has a Beaver Creek address. Like, how come? Maybe they just gave us a different address. Maybe they can go home. Maybe it's a periphery thing and it's impacting the response. Maybe, right? There's a lot of things there, and understanding that need of the client when we go from that evac center to non-congregate is valuable, because, right, if somebody's not impacted and they just saw the Red Cross offering hotel rooms, it might not be most appropriate for us to provide them a place to stay if they can safely return home. Perfect. Cool. Thank you for bringing that up, Barb. Much appreciated. So great. We'll continue on in the day's programming. So Sue, I'll tee you up. So Sue is going to talk a little bit about reunification and ways that they have used the non-congregate client tracking tool to help them provide services. So Sue, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. So I worked virtual for Hurricane Laura and for the California and Oregon fires. And for Hurricane Laura, we, our group was helping folks find loved ones. And initially we were calling the different shelters, and each of us had certain people we were trying to do research for. So we're calling the shelters. They're very busy. They're looking through paper. And then we were told to stop calling the shelters. I think it was, was getting too much of a burden for them to be called and looking through their long lists of folks. And then they started to use the tool. So we would go out in the evenings. And I think some of the folks have alluded to that, it's, if somebody's putting data in it, then things are, the spreadsheet's jumping around. So we would go in later in the evening when things had calmed down, and we could look at the different shelters and we could do our own searches. So we weren't bothering the staffs there that were so busy. One thing the reunification folks can do also is if they can download the spreadsheet, it's a point in time, but we're not entering data in the spreadsheet, so we don't have to have the real-time spreadsheet tool, and so that way it can be, it can be at a point in time, and we can go through all the lists and see if we can find someone. I hadn't for the folks that I was looking for, I didn't find anyone that I was looking for, but a couple of the people were able to locate folks at shelters, because a lot of for Hurricane Laura, a lot of the people were moved into other states, Texas and other places. So looking in the Louisiana area wasn't getting results for them. So it was definitely useful for us, though, overall as a tool to find folks.
Great, thanks, Sue. Much appreciated, right? And it's cool to see how when we in Sheltering are able to capture good client information, that it benefits reunification and helping reconnect families together. And right in our scenario, we saw that exact thing happening. And so in theory, at the end of the day, Sue would have gone in, pulled that information, said, oh, like we can reconnect this family, so that now we're reuniting families in that time of disaster. So Sue, thanks so much for sharing that. Anybody have any questions for Sue, reunification, and how it relates to the non-congregate client tracking tool?
And there's nothing in the chat.
Perfect. Thanks, Thea. And I don't see KG Campanella on. I will say that and then pause just here in a second to see if she is on. She was going to do a little bit about how DMH has used the non-congregate client tracking tool, but she is supporting the Boulder MCI. So KG, are you out there anywhere? Okay, cool. We will continue right along. Diana, if you could do me a huge favor and pull up the slide deck, that would be fantastic. So we run through our shelter resident transition. And as that's getting pulled up, just want to call out as a reminder, thank you so much for talking us through the processes a little bit and on how we went from evacuation center to a non-congregate shelter. The reason that's so valuable is one of the things we plan to do over the next many weeks and before the start to middle of May is start to publish, quote unquote, publish, share that tool and kind of what that process will look like so that when we have to do it in NOCO or when we have to do it in WECO, we can follow a similar process on how we go from evac center to non-congregate shelter, just to make sure that we've got that continuity and consistency of care for our residents. So. Perfect. We will shift gears. Super excited to be doing this. Do want to check with everybody. Can everybody see the screen? Is it big enough, etc.? Okay, seeing thumbs up, so perfect. We're good to go. If you do need it to be bigger at all, in your Teams feature, you can go up right next to your camera button. There's a little 3 dots. If you click on that, you'll get a drop down and you can do focus or full screen, and that'll make it a little bit bigger for you as well. So great. This will be the first time we've offered this kind of presentation. So as you see on the slides, there's starting to be some sheltering managers, those that serve at DR headquarters courses, and really looking at how a couple of key roles impact that position, from the Assistant Director of Operations and AD of Ops, a Mass Care Chief, and then a Shelter Resident Transition Manager, and how all those interact with this key sheltering role. So really, over 10 or 15 or so slides, we'll walk through what Shelter Resident Transition is. So Dinah, if you can take us on to the next slide, where we want to start here, and you'll see the slide come back up later on, but we really just take 30 seconds. If you've got a notepad by you, maybe a phone where you can take notes, maybe it's you open up your email and type in some notes real quick. Just want to pause and have all of you reflect individually, what role does sheltering have in supporting the transition of clients from shelters? So we'll take a pause to ponder. Okay, so that was just about 30 seconds. Hopefully you were able to write something down. If you weren't, I really encourage you to, because what we want to do is just start to walk through what actually is shelter resident transition, how does sheltering support, and then we're going to end with this question. And at that point in time, I'm going to ask everybody to share, like, did the perception change? Is it what you thought it was, etc.? Is the role of sheltering what you thought it was? So just know that's where we're headed, and that's why we ask for the pause. So Diane, if you can take us on to the next slide. Starting at the foundational level, we just want to talk a little bit about client-first sheltering and how it intersects. So as always, right, we serve a lot of individuals within our shelter, and that's what leads to it being called mass care. And sometimes we think in those big gross terms, gross as in large, about our individuals in a shelter. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight that, like, that is one family with 5 individuals. And so we really want our emphasis to be on meeting those individual needs of our residents, whether they have poisonous or non-poisonous snakes, whether they need to be reconnected with family, whether they need specific meals. But that's really the focus of this client-first sheltering. With that, it's the role of everyone to support a client's recovery. It's both the clients, it's a Red Cross shelter workers, it's a individual disaster care workers, so health services, mental health, and it's shelter resident transition workers' role to support that. And the reason we cast that broad net is that everybody is having a touch base with a client and learning about the individual, their needs, their anticipated needs, and their articulated needs. We'll get to a slide that really shows a graphic on that here in a little bit. And then just know that shelter resident transition is an aspect of the client first sheltering. And it is a piece of our sheltering services that we provide when we open and operate a shelter. So as we roll to the next slide, we'll define this a little bit further. So shelter resident transition, again, is a component of the Red Cross sheltering program. And really it's to enable our shelter residents, the Red Cross and our partners, to identify recovery roadblocks that are prohibiting the resident from transitioning forward in their recovery from our shelter that's temporary to a more permanent solution. It's really about providing services to meet those articulated and anticipated needs. And a part of this shelter resident transition process is a thing that we call the shelter resident assessment, or the SRA. And that's really just the facilitation and the gathering of information as we identify those factors prohibiting a shelter resident from transitioning from the shelter. And so, right, if we think about, let's put our sheltering hat on, we're serving meals, maybe we have the opportunity to sit down and have a meal. I recognize we might not be doing that in a COVID environment. But as we're having that conversation, we're getting to know our clients, right? We're spending time with them. We're hearing about what life was before they were in a shelter. We're hearing about where they want to go. And so Thea might hear that the family really is looking for a 2-bedroom apartment and that they're willing to go move out of state because there's limited housing stock. If Thea hears that, like, that's part of understanding what their plan is to transition. And ideally, Thea doesn't hold that to herself and not tell anybody. But now we can share and start to pass that information along to like a shelter resident transition caseworker that can help actually take an action to move them forward in that recovery. It could even come up when health services is talking with a client and they hear about maybe a mobility need that would influence the type of home that they would be able to live in after the disaster. So I saw a hand pop up. I'm going to intentionally not take that. I'm going to go through 2 more slides and I'll pause for questions. So Diana, if you can take us to the next one. So as we think about our shelter resident assessment, that's that gathering of information. We used to have a thing called the Shelter Resident Assessment Tool. That was a Power App that all you needed was a Red Cross email to access. Some of you might have seen that. Some of you might not have. Some of you might have seen it in a spreadsheet form. But that's been sunset. And now we do all of our documentation of shelter resident transition via the Shelter Resident Transition Recovery Roadblock in RC Care, which means we have to have RC Care access and etc. And so there's that coordination needs to happen back and forth. But ultimately, the RC Care will be our record of shelter resident transition. And there's some cool dashboards that we'll see later on that really help us understand some visuals and some graphics that we have that come from that. So Diana, as you take us on to the next one, we're going to highlight what those shelter resident transition workers are actually doing in a shelter, like when they're working with a family after our shelter resident assessment has been completed, and they're moving into building that plan, what we call the shelter resident transition plan. It's really intended to be led by the client and supported by us, the Red Cross, right? We want clients leading their recovery. We want to be empowering of their recovery. We don't want to necessarily like handhold and drag them through, right? That's not the intention of our casework and SRT services. It's probably going to be created over numerous interactions and is flexible to accommodate change, right? So Sue might think, I've got the solution, it's figured out. And when we go to take action on it, it changes, right? We need to be responsive to that environment of change that is a disaster and causes us to be quick on our feet. It's also equitable for our clients. We use the word equitable, not equal, because equitability is really what does the individual need to be successful, as opposed to saying everybody gets the same thing. We want to verify that the plan will actually work and be successful. It is focused on the housing, safe, sanitary, and sustainable housing. That'll be the main focus. But we can't lose sight of the other pieces, and that's that individual and family overall recovery and supporting of that physical, psychological, overall well-beings. And it's focused on those disaster cause needs, right? Sometimes it's hard to separate out pre-existing conditions from disaster because those pre-existing ones might have only been exacerbated by the disaster itself, but it's really focused on the disaster caused needs, getting them towards housing. So I'll take a pause now, right? Just kind of gave a quick overview of what shelter resident transition is, what those plans look like. We'll get into more detail here in a little bit, but I want to pause and what thoughts or questions are out there now. And Ed,
Yeah.
I think I see your hand still up.
Yeah, my question was, as more and more of us are getting completely vaccinated, are there any changes being made to how we interact with? I know in the near term, we're going to always wear masks and gloves and social distance, but is there anything they're working on as far as people that are already vaccinated, maybe clients that are vaccinated, how all that is changing?
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I was on some of you might have been on it as well. There was like 3,000 people on the call. Gail McGovern had a fireside chat with Dr. Anthony Fauci, which was pretty sweet. If you haven't seen it, we can make sure that you get a recording of it, talking about vaccinations and where's it going, etc. And the last time we knew, the organization was still going to be primarily virtually, ensuring that we're masked when we go out, in Red Cross services, and doing that non-congregate focus sheltering. We might see, as more and more people get vaccinated, we might start to see some shifts on that, but currently nothing's been put out in writing or officially.
I haven't really seen anybody collecting data as far as volunteers on their profile, whether they're vaccinated or not. Is that something we're working on also?
I was looking through the participant list to see if Ashley Turner was on. I know there had been some conversations back and forth about that, but Ed, I don't know where it quite landed. So I can take that for action and follow up and see if there's a clean spot that's been decided on where that information should go in Volunteer Connection.
Yeah, I don't need a personal answer, just in general, what we're doing with it.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll see if we can't get something related to that for the next session, just to speak at least a little bit about where we stand and where we're headed.
Perfect.
Perfect. Any other thoughts or questions out there before we move along? Perfect. So I'm going to assume that the no questions, it was either described perfectly or that was a great review and most of you were aware of all this. So Diana, as you take us on to the next one, we'll get into a bit more of the meat of things. About structures and table of organizations and where this really falls. So here we see a table of organization, and this would be when there is a DRO administered service delivery. So this does not include like a district model. So at the very top, we see our Assistant Director of Operations. Below them, we see a Deputy Assistant Director of Recovery and a Deputy Assistant Director of Response, also known as Data Recovery, Data Response. Below them, we have a Mass Care Chief. Underneath that Mass Care Chief, we have that DRO HQ Sheltering Manager, which is really that person that's coordinating all of the shelters that are open and helping make sure that our shelter site managers that we see on that next tier down on the right-hand side, they're really equipped and feeling successful for taking care of the facility and the people inside of the facility. Important to call out, this is where we see our first shelter resident transition position come out, and it's the DRO HQ SRT coordinator who reports directly to the DRO HQ sheltering manager. And they're really there to kind of be that guide and support for all things transition and kind of that subject matter expert, probably with lots and lots of recovery experience. And when they need help, their boss is the sheltering manager at DRHQ, but they've also got this nice dotted line to the data of recovery, who is overall of recovery on the operation and really they're doing some problem solving and support using RC Care, etc. But know that this individual does report through sheltering. Next, that next level down, we see our shelter site managers. And in a shelter, our shelter site managers might oversee, or probably oversee, our feeding operations inside the shelter in support of feeding. They oversee our dormitory, our registration, and etc. Maybe it's so big that we even have supervisors in each of those categories. A new component, right, that's being added in is this SRT site manager, who's really helping in the one facility. It could be multiple, but it's probably in the one facility, overseeing that shelter resident transition and moving people forward, helping them focus on their recovery, building a plan, helping build those relationships between sheltering and IDC and SRT, all for the benefit of the clients that we're helping move forward, right? We have to remember that our hotels and our congregate facilities are temporary housing solutions, not new permanent ones. And it's important to acknowledge that that person does report to the shelter site manager, right? So our shelter site managers out there that would be leading a shelter know that you'll have this great resource available to you, just like you would have somebody that can oversee your registration so that they're managing it and you're just helping task delegate on things that need to happen. Then under that SRT site manager, we do have our SRT caseworkers. And these, think of these as kind of the gray skies version of our blue skies caseworkers, right? These are people that have RC Care access, understand our recovery systems and processes and eligibilities, etc. And they're really there, that instrument to help take those final steps for the client and build that plan, provide the service through RC Care, and help them transition from the shelter. So as we move along to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about maybe some integration of all of these things on how this all works, and I'll take another pause for questions. So really what this graphic is trying to show is that the support within inside of a shelter is matrixed and kind of complex, and we're all there helping one another, right? Because we're all helping the clients recover. So gray at the top, right, the event happens. And then after the event happens, in some instances, clients come to our shelter and we register them into a shelter. Notice here that that's yellow. And so the people who are registering clients into shelters are most likely our shelter workers. Then after folks have been registered, our shelter workers are going to focus in on providing that mass care and support. Do we have cots? Are we making sure we've got food in the right places? Is our dormitory clean? Are we providing that safe place for them to rest each night? And our health services, our mental health, etc., is engaged in that cot-to-cot process, helping take a temperature metaphorically of the room. How are we doing? Like, do they have the support and the care that they need? Both of those might even be happening ongoing, intermixed, etc. During some of that stuff, we see this next level come out, is that we start to understand our clients' individualized shelter transition needs. Again, that shelter resident assessment. And that's going to happen by a lot of different people through those natural conversations that are happening, right? If we think about our non-congregate environment, it might be that there's only 2 shelter workers on the ground and everybody else is virtual. And so those 2 shelter workers are going to have a lot of contact that other people might not be aware of. And as that contact happens, we might be learning about our clients and we can share that information, and we want to be sharing that information. As we start to get that understanding, eventually we're going to create a shelter resident transition plan. And this is really where those shelter resident transition caseworkers are your expert and your best friend to really help solidify, document, even brainstorm and problem solve what that plan could look like, and document it within RC Care so that we can provide those resources to facilitate the transition. Is it a referral to a partner? Is it financial assistance? Is it etc.? That those connections that can help successfully result in this transition, ultimately the outcome is what we're looking for, right? To help our clients move forward in their recovery. And this is really trying to picture this like integrated approach that we all have a role to play here, and it's really helping us try to visualize that. I'll call out two things and then I'll take a pause. So on the right-hand side, you see those gray boxes. I recognize that might be kind of hard to read, but there might be some timelines just to help us conceptualize broadly that when these things happen by, right? We know that we are always going to provide for our mass care needs of clients and do those cot-to-cot processes. That's just going to happen on an ongoing basis. And then as we think about those next steps, if we assign a time frame to them, it's really just trying to help us focus that our locations of shelter are temporary. So ideally, we're starting to understand our clients' needs within the first 3 days. Then ideally, we're starting to create some transition plans within the first 4 days. And then finally, when we have a plan that we can take action on, we should be doing that at any point in time. Whether that was right when they came through the door, whether that was 2 days into their stay, or maybe it takes a month. But know, and we'll get into this in later slides, know that there's a way that when we identify a need, we can take an action, and shelter resident transition is really there to help us take that action to facilitate transitioning forward. Final thought here is that since RC Care is the system of record, somewhere in these middle phases, a case will be opened up in RC Care. Maybe it's opened up by the nurse who had to issue some funds. Maybe it's opened up by the caseworker who's creating the plan, right? There's a couple different places there where we would create a case in RC Care and use that as kind of that client management system for shelter resident transition. Okay, thoughts, questions on structure and kind of the order of events that are out there. And Ed, I see that your hand is up.
Yeah, good afternoon or good morning. Going back to the organizational chart where you talked about the SRT and how it fits into a structure. What about those situations where you have an evacuation center and not necessarily a shelter? Like our experiences from the summer, you had one evacuation center and multiple shelters. How does the SRT fit into a scenario where you don't have a shelter, but you have an evacuation center? Is there any difference in how that would play out?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ed. So the answer is yes. So our evacuation centers are temporarily short-term, not providing overnight stays, so normally only last a couple of hours. So you probably won't see shelter resident transition manifest a lot in those evacuation centers, because an evacuation center is just that. We're trying to figure out what's going on and what the needs of our clients are going to be. Are they going to need overnight stays? And if we remember that shelter resident transition is there to facilitate the recovery and the transition from an overnight shelter, if we're not in an overnight shelter, it might not be a service we need to be providing.
Okay, so you're talking about strictly a shelter situation where mainly it's transitional in nature.
That is correct, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Garrick, we have a comment in the chat I can read to you. It's from Trish Palomara. Similar to clarifying who is eligible for Red Cross hotel/shelter, would be good to clarify how long and what level Red Cross will be supported.
Yeah, Trish, I saw that your hand popped up in the chat and then went down. Do you want to come off and add anything to that?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It took me a second here to get that off. Yeah, I think, Eric, based on my experience and probably certainly the experience of others who are here on this call, there's been some, there's been some discrepancies with different events within the region and then certainly outside the region on what qualifies someone for, Red Cross support and coverage to begin with. And then I think the flip side of that coin is what you're referencing here, how long, what duration, and what criteria is used for continuing to provide support, or at what point are clients expected to, kind of move on, make their decision. And I can talk more about that if it's not clear, but I think that's a place where there could be some help in terms of giving some guidance on both of those points.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. I'll only attempt to address the latter because the first, I think, is something that is known and aware, and like we will get to a point where like not as what is shelter resident eligibility. It's not what I'm saying, but like, how do we make those decisions that in a non-congregate world or in a congregate setting, we should be providing sheltering services here. So let's acknowledge, but I'm not going to try to answer that one here. And I appreciate the question because it's something that I haven't said yet that I should talk to. So to this point, right, shelter resident transition, it's been said before, but it's always happened in our shelters, right? We've always had, at some point in time, a caseworker helping transition a client from a shelter, right? That's happened. Sometimes clients can leave organically on their own, and sometimes they need a little bit of a boost. And that's still going to happen here. So everything we've talked about at like to this point in time, this should be happening on any operation where there's a shelter, right? If we've got people that are staying overnight in our location, we should be starting to think in this way so that we're providing a complete picture and good care to our clients. That's the broad answer. More specifically, the current construct and stuff we'll get into when we start to talk about financial assistance eligibility is that shelter resident transition financial assistance is available on level 4 and greater operations. On lower level operations, there are still funds available. It'll be through our recovery planning. So what's really important for you all as shelter workers and that mindset to have is that there are people and funds available to help support our clients transition from a shelter when they need the support. And then it's just making sure we're asking for that kind of help and sharing with those individuals so that, again, it's for the benefit of the client that we're doing this client-centric sheltering approach. Trish, does that help, or did I just muddy the waters even more?
No, I'm glad to hear that. It sounds like, Eric, what you're saying is that there's some, internal discussions in terms of perhaps trying to give some even further clarification, right? On some of these points.
Correct,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Garrick, there's also a question in the chat from Darlene Moore, kind of talking about how a mark would different or be the same as like a shelter resident transition plan as well. Just on a different level.
Cool, thanks for that, Thea. So a MARC is a multi-agency resource center. It is usually a standalone facility that has lots of partners, hence the multi-agency. And people go there seeking assistance, and they might come in and be able to talk to 15 different agencies to receive the assistance they need to help them in their recovery. Shelter resident transition is focused inside of a shelter, and we might bring in external partners to help facilitate as we understand our client's need, like the DMV to replace driver's license, or the Southern Baptist to help with muck and gut, or etc. And so it almost kind of turns into like a MARC within a shelter, but it wouldn't be called a MARC at that point in time. But the principle still maintains that as we understand our clients' needs, we can better bring resources to the table, whether inside the shelter or a referral outside of the shelter that can help them in their recovery. Cool. Before we continue along and kind of talk more about qualifications and some examples of financial assistance, any other thoughts out there? Perfect. So Diana, if you can continue us along, I won't spend a terrible amount of time on this, but I do want to make you all aware of the financial assistance eligibility and then what those funds are and kind of how those funds can be used. Again, remember that as we go through this, there's a couple key things. The provision of shelter resident transition financial assistance does require RC Care access, right? So if you do not have access to RC Care, you would not be able to provide it. And that our SRT financial assistance is different from immediate assistance, right? And that immediate assistance, if any of you are DAT workers, you know that's what we provide on a single family house fire, that quantity of funds to help simply because they had damage to their home, like that major destroyed and uninhabitable. So this is different from that. So kind of create a division in your mind. The other thing that's calling out, again, what we're going to talk through is specifically on level 4 and greater operations. But as Trish echoed beautifully, know that there's a couple internal conversations around what does that look like? And on lower level operations, there are still funds available via our recovery planning services. It just looks a little bit different. But the broad concept that I want all of you to take is that there are funds, there are eligibility to receive those funds, and we're only going to accent one side of those presently. So, perfect. All right, so with that as my level set, qualifications. So let's think we're on the Cameron Creek Fire, we're on a level 5 operation, and like what are the qualifications for our residents in a shelter to be eligible for that financial assistance? They need to be a current resident, not a past resident, a current resident in a Red Cross managed shelter for at least 3 consecutive days. So Ed, that answers your question about what about an evacuation center? We normally don't operate those with an individual in there for 3 consecutive days. Then it becomes a shelter, right? The one exception around that is the shelter site manager working with the SRT site supervisor can make that determination that, hey, there's something we can do, like a bus ticket, getting them to a relevance home, replacing their car tires, replacing a car battery, that can immediately terminate their need to stay at the shelter, i.e. providing them a transition. And the shelter site supervisor and the SRT site supervisor can make that determination together and provide assistance bypassing that 3-day rule. Other ones that hold true is that the client needs to state and demonstrate impact. That's not based on damage assessment, so our majors and destroyed for those familiar with that. We just need to know that they have damage to their home. The client needs to have a recovery roadblock, right? They need to have something that is prohibiting them from transitioning. These are the ones that we see in RC Care. And then there should be a plan that allows them to transition, right? We're providing funds for a reason, and we want to make sure that that plan is there and that they can transition within 72 hours. That might feel a little bit weird at first, but the important thing there is that Trish might have a perfect plan, but it might take her 2 days to secure that apartment. And so she needs a 2-day window to receive the funds, to secure the apartment, and then to move in. So we get a little bit of a window there on after we provide the funds, kind of there's a window for transition to happen. So Dinah, if you take us to the next slide, and actually if you can take us to slide 11, please. I think that's going to be the best one here for our group. So this is just a quick little table about funds that are available and then the intent and how we could overcome that. So, right, remember RC Care is how we issue funds. Within RC Care, there's kind of 3 different categories on how we can issue funds. That expedited, i.e. pre-72 hours, the normal amount, which would be anything after 72 hours, and then an exception that allows us even more funds to be available for the benefit of our client to transition. So let's walk through a couple of these examples. So let's think about shelter just opened. We just went from our evacuation center, and now we're in a non-congregate shelter. And LeBron James comes down, right, one of our clients, and indicates that, like, hey, man, all I need is a bus ticket, and me and the family can go back to Ohio, to Cleveland, so we can play for the Cavaliers again, right? Like, that's all we need. If that comes up, encourage you as soon as possible to talk to your supervisor, get a hold of the shelter resident transition folks, because we can take an action to replace car battery, get that bus ticket so that they can immediately transition and move forward in their recovery. Again, that immediate requires RC Care access and a couple steps there. But if you're hearing things like that, just know that there's a conduit that we can start to take action for the benefit of our client's recovery. Another example, let's say that Bruno Mars was actually not from Grand Junction, gave us the wrong address. Him and his family are in. And as we're working through that plan, we figure out that the conversations with the caseworkers, and we develop that plan, and we know that they're going to go for first month's rent and security deposit so they can move into a new place. Our shelter resident transition caseworkers through RC Care can issue a quantity of funds up to $300 directly to support that first month's rent, security deposit, And then probably what they're going to do is also try to find a referral outside to Salvation Army or a Goodwill or a thrift store for some furniture, etc., to support that recovery. Final example here would be that exception, that really, really big need. So let's use our Peyton Manning comes down, right? And they've just got lots of troubles and they need more than usual. And because it's a pretty nice area, maybe that $300 isn't enough for first month's rent or security deposit. Maybe they need up to $1,000 to support that. This exception process allows us to meet that exceptional need for repair costs, critical appliance replacement, short-term leases to repair homes, etc., so that Peyton Manning and his family can transition from our temporary shelter to a more permanent solution. So just know that there are funds available and kind of different examples about how those could be used, ultimately supporting our clients' recovery. So before we move along to the next slide, I just want to take a pause here, and I would love to hear from anyone. Have you ever been in a conversation before where some of these needs or barriers have come up, and you're like a shelter worker and you're getting that information? I'd love to hear if anybody's had that before. So Trish, I saw your hand pop up, so feel free to go.
Actually, I was going to put it in the chat, but if Tom Detke's on the phone, he may recall in North Carolina back in after Hurricane Florence, we found that several clients, the only thing that was really standing in the way of them moving forward was they needed luggage. They were more than happy to take Greyhound buses and get out of town. And so we actually worked with the local church and had huge donations of luggage. That probably allowed 5, 6, 8 different clients at least and their families to move forward. So it's not always what you might think. It's not like necessarily just a check, but it could be an item as simple as luggage, because Greyhound wouldn't allow them to get on the buses with open bags. Had to be something with a closure on it.
Yeah, thanks, Trish. And that that feels like such a small thing that it's just luggage. And know that when that happens, please make it known, because if it's all they need is luggage and a bus ticket, we want to help support that, because we don't want them to sit around for 3 weeks when all they needed was a bus ticket and luggage, and they could have been at grandma's house somewhere else, starting their recovery outside of our Red Cross shelter. So thanks, Trish. Thea, I see your hand went up, and then we'll go to Darlene.
This actually happened to me when I was at the flooding in Omaha, Nebraska, in 2017. The families that were in the medium-sized shelter that we had still didn't know if they were going to be allowed back in their homes, when or if they were going to be allowed back. Some because of ground contamination, they just had to wait for the city and the counties to condemn their property, which meant they could never live there again. So this one family did find out after they were in the shelter about a week, and they found out that the county and the state would no longer allow them to live on that property because of contamination. So they were able to secure a relative up in South Dakota. So, but the problem is they didn't have a means to get there. They didn't have money for rent. So we immediately brought that. I was actually the shelter manager there. We brought that up to the attention of the sheltering manager, and the shelter resident transition really wasn't as big as it is now back then. So they were able to do that and accommodate their transportation for their whole family. They had 5 kids and 2 adults. It was grandma, grandpa, and all the grandkids, so that they could be with their relatives up in South Dakota permanently. And they helped them secure a rental home and everything. So that worked out well.
Cool, thanks, Thea. And just to echo, right, as a shelter worker interfacing with a family, whether it's a congregate or non-congregate setting, you're going to learn this stuff. And just please don't keep it to yourself, right? We want to share it so that we can start to take action, so that whether it's the bus ticket or we got to get them they want to go to South Dakota and we want to support that, the sooner that we can do that, right, the better it's going to be. So thanks for that, Thea. Darlene, I think you're the last one with your hand up.
Yes, I can't remember which disaster I was on, but the last ones to leave the shelter, of course, were homeless, and they had lost what little belongings they had. And what we ended up doing is getting them tents, sleeping bags, and stoves, and sent them on their way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Every time we do a presentation like this, homelessness comes up. Like, how do we handle that in a shelter situation? How does that handle in this? And I think it's important that we acknowledge that if somebody wants to return to the streets with a tent and a sleeping bag, it is not our responsibility to tell them that is a bad idea, right? If that's what somebody wants to do, we should be supportive of that. If they didn't want to do that and they wanted to help get into a homeless rapid rehousing program, we should do our best to support that. And the thing that needs to be acknowledged, right, is that when we build these plans, they need to be feasible, right? It would be inappropriate for me to think I want to live on the 10th floor of the 10 Seasons in Denver because I can't afford that ongoing, right? So we balance desire with applicability, and is that a feasible solution? So thanks, Darlene. Great. Diana, if you can take us to the next slide, please. We'll run through just a couple of cool visuals that exist that I want all of you to be aware of, because you should be asking for this stuff, especially if you're on a bigger operation like a level 4 or greater. And then we'll close out with a bit of reflection and then any other Q&A. So these are, the next two slides are just pictures and dashboards and reports that are available from RC Care. So right, we're on a large scale operation, a level 6 operation in Louisiana, and we know that we're keeping our shelter records. We know that shelter resident transition has started. There's actually a way to visualize how many people shelter resident transition has documented and in what hotels. That's that visual in the top left-hand corner. So we could see that there are 860 clients in a myriad of hotels. Then we'd want to say, does that number match? Does the shelter resident transition number match with the sheltering number? And are we seeing the same number of people in each hotel? Or is one seeing more, one seeing less? Another example of what we can do, because we track household size, is based on an RC Care intake. We ask how many people are in the household, and we can now visualize how many folks are in a household by hotel, for example. So on this chart, we see that there is 12, a family of 12, a family of 11, a family of 9, and a family of 8, right? Those are really big families to be in a shelter situation. Not that a family of 1 should be in a shelter situation, right? But like, those are huge numbers, and that might be a focus area on our transitioning. Let's start with the families first and then go to the individuals kind of thing. So just two ways that those visuals can be used. Diana, if you take us to the next slide, this is probably one of my favorite visuals that exists. But a graph and a chart can be built that helps shelter resident transition articulate to sheltering what is the actual and planned transition dates of individuals. So let's say that Ed is the caseworker working with Thea, the clients, and we know that Thea is going to transition on April 3rd. Or March 21st, we can note that, and then we can pull a report that takes that, and we can say, hey, shelter site manager, here are the 5 families from the work of shelter resident transition who should be transitioning from the shelter today. Can you help make sure that happens? And in those non-congregate worlds, that's so important, because there might be a virtual versus in-person coordination that has to happen, because we want to make sure we're walking forward in lockstep and not one outpacing the other. So know that there are ways in RC Care, especially if you're on a level 4 bigger operation, that this stuff is available and should be asked for, because it's only going to help us provide good services to our clients. So Diana, as you take us to the next slide, I think there's a best practices one in here. So just to summarize some of the stuff that we've seen from 2020, when we really got to implementing shelter resident transition, and then even over the past 4 months in 2021, as we've used RC Care, is that there's a difference between congregate and non-congregate, and it's so important that we have a coordinated effort between our in-person workers, boots on the ground, which might be shelter worker, might be health services, might even be shelter resident transition, and the virtual workers, which are probably shelter resident transition, health services, mental health. Like we can't be at odds with one another, and we need to be sharing information and staying in coordination, even if that means daily meetings, so that we're not telling one client one thing on the phone, telling them another thing when they come down for dinner, right? That just leads to frustration for our clients. The other thing is that collaboration is key. Like, it is essential, right? It's one of our 5 C's as an organization, that collaborative, and we need that to come to life in our shelter situations in a myriad of ways. That can be daily meetings between shelter site manager, shelter resident transition site supervisor, and our individual disaster care. It could be including our SRT workers in the daily shelter stand-up meetings. It's that sharing of our client transition and planned departure dates. It's even the messaging that we have to clients that might be about resources that are available to them in the shelter, outside of the shelter, nearby, even a flyer communication that's going out. We should make sure that all of that's happening in lockstep. And it's important to remember that client recovery is supported by all Red Cross workers, and that includes the good news and the not so good news. So that might be that we're changing hotel rooms, or we're moving hotels, or that we're starting to work with families that have minor and affected damage first, and then getting on to majors and destroyed, because those minor and affecteds can probably return home since their home doesn't have major damage, right? That coordinated effort across the good and the bad news. We shouldn't have one person solely delivering bad news to clients. That's a shared thing, just like celebrating the successes is as well. So Diane, if you take us on to the next slide, please. We're going to take another 30 seconds, and I just want everybody to pause and reflect, like, what is the role of sheltering and supporting our shelter clients transition from the shelter? Like 30 seconds, think on it, and then I'd love to have a little bit of a discussion as we close out our time here. So. All right, so that was our 30 seconds. Diana, if you can take us to the final slide here, just the questions one, that'd be great. Thanks. So would love to hear, feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand so we're not fumbling over one another. Would love to hear, like, what is the role of sheltering in supporting our residents transition from a shelter?
Garrick, in the chat, Tom Belpley said it's a triage for recovery.
Totally. Yep. That's one piece of it for sure. Thanks, Tom. You're a pro at this, so I'd expect nothing less from you. Ed Dubois, I see your hand is up as well.
Yep. I keep it simple. I just look at it as assisting them as in clients from displacement to placement. And our challenges, are the roadblocks, and we just work them methodically from point A to point B to C and resolve them.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. Wholeheartedly agree. I think there was another one that popped in the chat box about Communications Hub. Thanks, Trish. Like helping facilitate and sharing that information. Yeah, definitely. Any other thoughts out there? If not, I will call on some folks just so you guys know. Cool. Hearing none, Diana, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you were running my slides for me. Like, thoughts on this, on sheltering's role in transitions?
Thanks for putting me on the spot, Gary. It's
Anytime.
No, I think it was great, very informative class. One of the things is that we continue, as Ed said, to get to know the clients in the shelter and basically be the eyes and ears for each client. Each client is different and they are, they have different needs, and just getting to know them and being the eyes and ears there when you're on the ground is very valuable.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Diana. And Sue, throughout the active listening, right, there's so much more to communication than speaking, and even we can listen with more than just our ears. There's that body language and how they're communicating that are so important as well. Yeah. Cool. I'll put one other person on the spot intentionally. Tom Bethke, I know you're listening. If you're there and available, any thoughts that you want to share with the group from your myriad of experiences?
Thanks, Garrick. I would have to say that starting from day one, the entry, even in the evacuation center, and going into a shelter environment, the importance of the tracking tool all the way, not only with the communication of the shelter workers and management, but working with our partners, because we might not be the ones that are necessarily opening the shelter or running the shelter. We might be under another umbrella of our partners. So working together, really the collaboration part of it is essential. And I do believe that the shelter worker, whether it's setting up cots or just the interaction with the client, is important, especially on the onset, and getting that information in the tracker to your managers, supervisors, to allow us as recovery caseworkers to take that information, because we use that on a daily basis pretty much early on, because we're looking at their progress on a daily basis. And the information that you give us, and we work together on this, is very important in the client's recovery in the long run. That initial, once it is into a level 4 and we are in SRT has been, dropped or launched, we're able to, that first 300 is insurmountable in some of these minor details to us, but a bus ticket or a flight or even reunification, that's a long one, with relatives, short, just anything to get them moving is very helpful, especially if it's documents, if it's bus tickets. These are essentials to get moving. They need communication. We can get them phones. We can hook them up with their services with that initial SRT funding. But we don't know that until we have the interaction with the client. So it all runs together, and it's really important to not only document it, but in the long run, it's a good thing to look at as far as future DRs on what's needed, the pros and cons of the long-term recovery, which is where I am now. And believe me, these are people that have been in the shelter for 7 months. Okay, and we're down probably, I think now down to the last 90. But these are people that are struggling, and some of these issues are insurmountable, but it's all starts at the shelter. And the daily conversations that you have as workers is really, really important to everybody and to the client themselves. But this is great, Garrick. This is really good to see. I'm hoping that everybody gets something out of this and moves forward with it for sure. That's
Yeah.
all I got.
Tom, that was perfect. We did not orchestrate that at all, but you just did a perfect summary of the past 2 sessions on collecting information. It all starts in sheltering, how we have those communications, those dialogues, how we share it with our partners, right? That's an internal partner like health services, reunification, shelter resident transition, so that our clients can transition forward in their recovery. And sometimes there are those extreme examples where it takes 7 months or longer. Most of the time, it's not that tedious to support transitions from shelters. So, Tom, that was perfect. Thank you so much for including that. Diana, I'm going to set you up to continue us along, but I just want to throw out that there will be another scenario related to how we tie all of this together. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to put it together before the meeting, so we'll get to that later today, and that'll come out as normal from Corey. But just know the next scenario is really going to look at how do we pull all these pieces together and creating this bigger picture approach to client first sheltering. So, Diana, thanks for the time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Garrick. This was great and very useful information. Does anybody have any other thoughts or comments before we close?
Yes, this is Clark.
Hi,
Good
Clark.
morning, everybody. And I'm traveling, so that's why I'm not participating as directly as normal, so I apologize to some degree. But Garrick, I did want to address this to you. It seems to me that one of the things we can do with the SST group is to really develop our actual operating process as to how we make this happen. And I'm looking at the idea of actually training and developing accountability for one of the strike team members to really be on point for the SRT process. And so we can have this discussion offline later, but I really think that, you know, if we create a system within our group that we have a point person within the shelter team to really make this happen and monitor it as it goes through, as Tom mentioned, and we've had many discussions about this, that is Tom and I, about how important it is to bring this to bear from the very beginning as soon as possible. And so I want to talk to you offline perhaps about how do we really make this work and make sure that it does take place on a DR at the level of that we're talking about. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Thanks.
Sounds great, Clark. Happy to have those conversations. I think it'll be immensely beneficial for all of us.
Thank you, Clark. Have fun out there. Anybody else? All right. So I don't know if we have the scenario. Corey couldn't join us either, but there will be one coming out if you can get your teams together for each chapter and go over the scenario for in 2 weeks. I believe it's going to be, oh, I don't have my calendar in front of me, but we'll be meeting again in 2 weeks. The training, we're going to have a special guest speaker from the American Humane Rescue, Josh Carey, who is the deputy director, and he's going to be discussing how the region and as well as national works with the pet sheltering, how we coordinate with Red Cross and the American Humane Rescue, and talk a little bit about the resources that we have here locally within our region. So it should be a very, very good meeting, and along with something else, I can't recall what it is. So all the information, the agenda will be distributed sometime next week, a week before. And if you have any other suggestions for trainings, please let me know. And other than that, happy Easter, everybody. Enjoy the weekend, and we hope to meet back in a couple of weeks. Bye.